All right, welcome. It's great to see everybody here. I'm going to do the usual introduction for the class for the benefit of those who don't come to the class each week and also for the benefit of those people online. So I'm Deborah Satz, and along with Paul Brest, I'm an instructor for this class. This is the third time Paul and I are teaching the class, and we had a bunch of different motivations for starting the class. First, no surprise to any of you, right? Deep disagreement pervades our democracy, from debates about immigration, taxation, foreign policy, the Mideast crisis, the role of higher education, and the value of free speech itself. And as I say every week, deep disagreement by itself is not a cause for concern. In a democratic society, we should expect people to disagree about many things. The societies where you see mass conformity tend to be societies run by dictators or autocrats. It isn't that to say that democracies don't also have problems with conformity. They do, but not at the same level, and we do see more disagreement. And that's because even well-motivated people trying to find agreement will often disagree based on their life experiences, based on the fact that evidence can be hard to interpret. There are a lot of things we still don't know, and so disagreement is a feature of a democratic society and not a bug, and there are many advantages to disagreement. I think I quoted last week from John Stuart Mill, who says, without being challenged, many of our views become dead dogma. We don't even know why we hold them. But not all disagreement is productive. Sometimes people shout out the views of other people that they don't agree with. Sometimes people don't listen very well or don't try to understand. Sometimes people don't treat each other with respect, which isn't to say that all views are equally the same in the court of truth, but all people are the same, right, are each other's equals and deserve respect, even if they hold views that we really disagree with. So part of the reason Paul and I started the course was around themes of disagreement in a democracy. We also think disagreement is really important to the university, where, after all, we're trying to produce knowledge, and knowledge is not produced when divergent opinions are suppressed or shouted out. And it's really important. Again, not every opinion is equal even though they're all equal before the First Amendment, they're not all equal in a university. We judge arguments by their logic and the rigor. We judge evidence. But the university depends on people being open to listening and to agreeing to disagree in a civil way. And we'll probably be talking a lot about civility and what its status is and how to think about it on university campuses. But it's because Paul and I thought that the mission of the university is important and was under threat, both from forces outside the university and inside, that we launched the course. All right, so that's the general introduction. We're really lucky today to have a great topic and a great lineup, which Paul will introduce, and then we'll have each speaker speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll have some moderated discussion, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So welcome.
So, welcome to our guests. Brief introductions. Shirin Sinnar is my dear and valued colleague at Stanford Law School. She holds an A.B. in history from Harvard and Radcliffe Colleges, a master's in philosophy from Cambridge University, and a J.D. from Stanford. Professor Sinnar's scholarship focuses on the legal treatment of political violence, the procedural dimensions of civil rights litigation, the role of institutions in protecting individual rights and democratic values in the national security context. Her recent work assesses legal responses to hate crimes and domestic and international terrorism under U.S. law. She has published articles in major law journals, one of which received the Mike Lewis Prize for National Security Law Scholarship. She served on the California Commission on the State of Hate Crime. In addition to some of these topics, Professor Sinnar teaches courses in basic and advanced civil procedure. A very popular and effective teacher, she received the Graduating Classes Award for Excellence in Teaching. Richard Shweder is a cultural anthropologist and Harold Swift Distinguished Service Professor of Human Development at the University of Chicago. He received his PhD in social anthropology in the Department of Social Relations at Harvard University. Professor Shweder's research in cultural psychology focuses on moral reasoning, emotional function, gender roles, explanation of illness, ideas about the causes of suffering, the moral foundations of family life practices, and the scope and limits of pluralism and the multicultural challenge in Western liberal democracies. He's the author of 2 books, Thinking Through Cultures, Expeditions in Cultural Psychology, and Why Do Men Barbecue, and the editor of many others. Among other honors, Professor Shweder is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society for Psychological Anthropology. On a day not very conducive, at least to outdoor protests, the broad question that our 2 colleagues will address is how should universities regulate the conduct of protests on campus in light of the educational missions of the universities. But we'll now put up the specific polling questions, which we will ask you now, and then after our 2 conversationalists have had their conversation, we will ask again. Should private universities provide wide latitude to student rallies and demonstrations promoting a political, moral, or social cause, even when the constitutional free speech protections applicable to such rallies and demonstrations in public spaces do not extend to public private campuses? So for those of you, many of you who are not familiar with kind of basic constitutional doctrine, the First Amendment imposes severe restrictions on the ability of any public institution to regulate speech. Basically, it can only regulate the time, place, and manner of protests. Private universities are not bound by the First Amendment. So Stanford, for reasons we need not go into, is bound effectively by the First Amendment because of California legislation. But most private institutions can make their own rules. So the question that Professor Sinnar and Professor Shweder will be discussing is, if you are such a private institution, what should those rules be? And Professor Sinnar will begin.
So thank you to Paul Brest and Deborah Satz for inviting me here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with Professor Shweder. And thanks to all of you for braving the storms and the rain to make it here. I'd like to begin with the mission of colleges and universities, because ultimately any disagreement about campus protests should begin with what we think colleges and universities are fundamentally for. I believe that universities aren't just about teaching students in the classroom or producing cutting-edge research and scholarship. They're also about preparing students for lives of active, engaged citizenship. You're not just here to start a company. You're not just here to solve a scientific problem or write a thesis in the humanities. You're here to learn how to live and solve problems with each other in order to form a more just and more equitable future. We learn the work of democratic citizenship by participating in it, not just by reading about it or debating theories and ideas. And democratic citizenship includes protesting the injustice we see around us, especially at a time when growing authoritarianism poses an existential threat to democracy. In the reading for this session, Professor Shweder writes that students should check their megaphones and banners at the campus gate. He argues that rallies and demonstrations where people chant slogans or advocate for causes are alien to academic life. I couldn't disagree more. Campus protests are a vital form of democratic disagreement and integral to the educational mission of universities. I want to make three main points in my opening remarks. First, on the educating role of campus protests, including rallies and demonstrations. Second, on the widespread efforts of universities in recent years to restrict protest. And third, on the historical role of disruption and civil disobedience on college campuses. So first, let me speak to what we learn and how we learn from protests. Leading and participating in campus protests can be incredibly instructive. From protests, you learn how to organize and motivate your peers. You learn how to resolve disputes when people differ over vision and tactics. You learn how to negotiate with administrators, trustees, and those in power. You learn how to bear witness when armed police suppress demonstrations with force. Protests also provide community and affirm the humanity of people who those in power are actively attacking, silencing, and dehumanizing. As one of our students said about the 100-day Palestine sit-in at Stanford, the sit-in was beautiful. I felt seen in a way that was precious to me, at a time when I felt invisible beyond words. As in Minneapolis, the collective action and mutual aid in protests reminds those who are suffering that they are not alone. For onlookers, rallies and demonstrations communicate ideas and the strength of people's convictions. They force you to listen when you would rather turn away. And they can produce deep discomfort. Many people preferred not to face the unfolding genocide in Gaza. They preferred not to see the obliteration of every single university, the destruction of nearly every hospital, the killing of 70,000 Palestinians, the displacement of nearly 2 million people, the use of forced starvation as a weapon of war, and the infliction of what independent human rights groups and UN experts concluded was a genocide. I have no problem with one-sided chants in rallies opposed to genocide or ICE killings in Minneapolis or against the political leaders and private companies that fund and fuel both. Of course, people can espouse a different view. They can rally to advance a different position, as people did at Stanford and on every college campus. Campuses should have space for passionate disagreement, even when it takes a collective form in White Plaza or other spaces, and not just in dialogue within classrooms. Recent opposition to campus rallies and demonstrations often seems to be rooted in a set of assumptions specifically about the Gaza protests. There's a suggestion that these demonstrations in particular excluded debate or rational argument. I saw in many such protests a discourse on Palestine more vibrant than anything offered in classrooms or faculty-led events. The sit-in to stop the genocide at White Plaza, which preceded the Columbia encampment by several months and ended up being the longest in the country, featured extraordinary efforts at education. There were film screenings, book clubs, call-a-thons to members of Congress, art shows, teach-ins, and hundreds of individual conversations with students, faculty, and students, often who disagreed. The discourse such protests generated was especially important because talks and academic events in support of Palestinian human rights faced explicit censorship, including at Stanford. So while decrying demonstrations as uncivil, many universities simultaneously canceled academic events and talks critical of Israel. Here at Stanford, students took to White Plaza because they did not see their views or the moral urgency of opposing the destruction of Gaza represented in leadership or most of their faculty. When you don't have voices in the room, those who are excluded will fight for a way to be heard. So that brings me to my second point on campus protest restrictions. There are some reasonable limits to the context and circumstances of speech and protest on campus. Of course, a university can restrict the use of bullhorns inside an academic building when classes are in session. Even where it applies, the First Amendment allows for reasonable restrictions on the time, place, and manner of expression on campus, provided that those restrictions don't target a particular viewpoint and that they leave ample alternative channels for communication. But college campuses in the last 2 years have enacted restrictions on speech and protest that have significantly constrained the space for campus debate. In the summer of 2024, after the encampments protesting the destruction of Gaza, donors and political officials pressured universities all throughout the country to enact new rules. Some colleges banned protests during the most natural times of day for students to protest. Some banned all use of amplified sound, making it very difficult for demonstrations to be heard. Some prohibited large gatherings or required people to pre-register and get advance permission from administrators. Some outlawed protests in the most visible of campus spaces. These rules have made it predictably difficult on many campuses to organize within the rules. The upshot is that the scope of what universities define as disruptive or violative has expanded. With increasing restrictions, what was in some cases free speech yesterday now has become civil disobedience. So that brings me to my third and final point on civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is often defined as the deliberate, nonviolent, conscientious violation of the law to communicate a message against injustice. It may be direct or indirect. Direct forms of civil disobedience challenge laws that are thought to be unjust in themselves, while indirect forms of civil disobedience challenge neutral rules to make a persuasive point. Either way, by definition, civil disobedience disrupts business as usual. By definition, it violates rules or law. But we have a long and celebrated history of civil disobedience on college campuses. So let's consider Stanford's own history. In 1968, after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, 70 Black students disrupted a public event by the university provost to demand increases in minority student enrollment, faculty diversity, and financial aid. Stanford agreed to double the enrollment of minority students by the following year. And the provost later said that that movement put Stanford on the path of correcting decades of exclusion. 1 year later, hundreds of students occupied the Applied Electronics Lab on campus to protest Stanford's classified war-related research contributing to the Vietnam War. That demonstration shut down the lab for 9 days. After that and other similar protests, Stanford agreed to end its support of classified military research. In 1977, nearly 1,000 students rallied against Stanford's investments in apartheid South Africa, and almost 300 students were arrested for refusing to leave the old Union Administrative Building. That mobilization inspired others across other campuses, and the South African divestment movement contributed to political pressure that ultimately ended the formal apartheid regime. In the 80s and 90s, students of color protested, including taking over the president's building, to protest a lack of minority hiring and ethnic studies. These efforts led to the expansion of community centers and a more inclusive curriculum. We celebrate many of these examples now. They led to substantial change on our campus and in our country. But many denounce these protests as uncivil, unreasoned, disruptive, and illegitimate in their own time. So as we consider how universities should respond to protests today, we should recall the historical role of civil disobedience in driving social change. Marginalized people have always confronted powerful interests who seek to hold on to their power and privilege. Those in power have often wielded civility discourse in an attempt to discredit challenges to their authority. Around the world, from Hong Kong to Iran, student movements have led mobilizations against authoritarian rule. So as we confront growing repression here in the United States, universities should respond to protests in a way that empowers students rather than silencing them. Thanks.
Well, hello, Democracy and Disagreement course. The 19th century philosopher and theologian John Henry Newman classified all disagreements into two types, those that are trivial and those that are insurmountable. The trivial disagreements are those spawned by correctable errors in the thinking of one or the other or both parties to the disagreement, errors such as faulty reasoning, ignorance of the facts, or the absence of a shared understanding of what is signified by the words used in the dispute, resulting in crosstalk rather than a genuine controversy. Such disagreements, the trivial ones, are easily reconciled or should just fade away once both parties clarify and coordinate the meaning of their terms, become aware of the true facts of the matter, and reason logically. The insurmountable disagreements, on the other hand, do not rest on error, ignorance, or confusion, but rather on matters of first principle. For example, on different axiomatic conceptions of the mission of the modern university and of the norms for engaging ideas that are befitting in a university community, given this or that axiomatic conception of the mission. Which norms for engaging ideas do I have in mind, and what axiomatic conception of the mission of the modern university drives and justifies them? Are they foolish ideals? Have they become postmodern antiques? To reduce the chance of having a disagreement based on crosstalk, this is my understanding of the meaning of the phrase rallies and demonstrations in the question of the day. The phrase brings to my mind gatherings where a campus commons is used as by an organized group of like-minded political, moral, or social activists to create an eye and ear-catching bully pulpit for partisan advocacy directed at all members of the university community in the hope of gaining their attention and exposing them to what the activists view as urgent ideas. Banners are waved, signs are displayed, chants are intoned, slogans, opinions, and demands are repeatedly shouted at passers-by and nearby captive audiences. Abortion is murder. Republicans are fascists. Go solar. We don't want no Zionists here. Defund the police, make America great again. When turned into a bully pulpit for promoting a political, moral, or social cause, the rally or demonstration ground is constituted as an assembly of supportive and sometimes cheering like-minded allies of the cause, its ideas, its ideals, and its specific calls for action. Should private universities provide wide latitude to rallies and demonstrations so defined? In response to the main question of the day, I'm going to hazard an answer of no. My answer is going to be far-reaching, heterodox, and against the current. It's likely to be unpopular, although I'm actually surprised to see the 28% who said no. But first, let me say something about the norms for engaging ideas at a university and the institutional mission that drives and justifies them. Regarding the norms for engaging ideas, my University of Chicago colleague, the political scientist Ethan Bueno de Mesquita, had this to say in an essay published in Boston Review. Quote, "At their best, universities are intellectual communities whose members collectively reason about, analyze, and debate our most important, vexing, and contentious questions in pursuit of truth. Moreover, an essential part of our teaching mission is to help students learn to better understand one another and the world by civilly engaging in these activities even when they deeply disagree." End quote. Or perhaps he had in mind a point, I think Professor Bueno de Mesquita seems to have had something like the mission and norms of this course on democracy and disagreement in mind when he wrote those words. Or perhaps he had in mind a point made in the Stone Report, the so-called Chicago Principles, namely that the norms for free expression at a university are designed to protect the liberty of its faculty and students to debate and discuss the merits of competing ideas, including controversial ideas that some might find upsetting, dangerous, or offensive. At a private university, that freedom of faculty and students to debate and discuss the merits of competing ideas and bring different viewpoints into contact with each other is a homegrown, contractually conferred right, not a First Amendment guarantee. As noted, our First Amendment liberties are binding only on state actors. They do not bind private institutions. Nevertheless, in the light of their distinctive institutional mission, private universities confer and are committed to the right of their faculty and students to discuss and debate competing ideas. The right is granted with the expectation that if that right is exercised and defended, then the core mission of the university will be served. It's that right to discuss and debate the merit of competing ideas that makes it possible to cooperatively resolve error-based disagreements, the so-called trivial ones, and failing that, it is that right to discuss and debate ideas that fosters the recognition, and perhaps in some instances even an appreciation, of the first principles and axiomatic assumptions behind those disagreements that are insurmountable. Perhaps that will happen here today, we shall see. Concerning the norms for engaging ideas at a university, listen to these words from a speech by a former president of Columbia University welcoming new students to the intellectual oasis of an American college campus. I quote from this speech because this university president eloquently expresses the defining educational mission of the modern university. I also turn to it because the speech was delivered on September 25th, 1946, in the wake of World War II. The speaker, his name was Frank Fackenthal, was well aware of the many right-wing and left-wing ideological and political conflicts, rallies, and demonstrations for or against fascism, communism, capitalism, liberalism, or for and against the rise of totalitarian regimes that had disrupted and distorted university life in various countries during the Great Depression of the 1930s and had led Europe, the United States, and East Asia into global conflict. This was the advice the president of Columbia University offered to the incoming class of 1946. Quote, "You who have reached the age of advanced study will of course have opinions, maybe even prejudices, but acceptance in an academic community carries with it the obligation to submit those opinions and those prejudices to examination under the bright light of human thought and experience. If perchance your views have been crystallized into slogans, held aloft on banners, or are subject to control by allegiance to minor or major pressure groups, check your banners and your membership cards at the college gate. If when you leave the university on commencement day, after having submitted yourself to the processes of true academic life, you wish to have back your old banner, claim it, and you can take your place in the body politic with the deep satisfaction of tested and confirmed judgment. Equally deep can be your satisfaction should you decide not to claim it, for you will know that you have the ability and the willingness to face and to evaluate ideas," end quote. In that welcoming address, a university president invited incoming students to place their political goals, their values, their pictures of the world, and themselves at intellectual risk, and to be willing to participate in critical, skeptical, sometimes upsetting, sometimes discombobulating, but never-ending truth-seeking conversations. He cautioned them to be skeptical of dogma. He suggested that they leave their banners, their slogans, and their partisan political identities at the campus gate. He cautioned them against the mobbing of ideas. That long-forgotten president of Columbia University gave an unforgettable speech in which he implied that rallies and demonstrations were anti-intellectual forms of expression and incompatible with the mission of an academic community. He spoke in Humboldtian tones. What are Humboldtian tones? The very idea of the modern university is often associated with the name Wilhelm von Humboldt, the Enlightenment-era Prussian philosopher of education, at whose initiative the University of Berlin was founded in 1810. Paraphrasing my own words from a recent essay about Humboldt's gift to us, Humboldt envisioned the university as a liberal, in the sense of open-minded and free-thinking community, committed to protecting the intellectual autonomy of its members in pursuit of knowledge and the cultivation of rational judgment. That was its distinctive and essential mission: knowledge creation and the cultivation of rational judgment, resulting, or so Humboldt hoped, in disciplinary expertise. He pictured the ideal university as an oasis, a temple of reason of sorts, where scholars are free to be intellectually innovative and skeptical of dogma and non-rational claims to authority. There, in a protected, self-governing academic community, popular beliefs and so-called received truths could be challenged and debated. It was not the mission of the university to be popular with the public or the state. Associated with those liberal ideas for the modern university were certain intellectual values and dispositions: disciplined impartiality, a willingness not to rush to judgment, organized skepticism, a fondness for dialogue and the questioning of assumptions, respect for critical reasoning informed by relevant and reliable evidence, the right to discuss and debate ideas. Over the years, that Humboldtian model of the university, with its focused and limiting emphasis on research and teaching, has enjoyed the support of many educators and academic institutions in the United States. Robert Maynard Hutchins, for example, the long-serving former president of the University of Chicago, defined the university this way, quote, "A university is a community of scholars. It's not a kindergarten, it's not a club, it's not a reform school, it's not a political party, it's not an agency of propaganda. A university is a community of scholars," end quote. Hutchins understood the many ways in which a university might lose its way, and he cautioned against them. Today, many of our universities have lost their way. With those Humboldtian ideals for the modern university in mind, let me now return to the question of the day. Should private universities provide wide latitude to student rallies and demonstrations promoting a political, moral, or social cause? As noted earlier, my answer is no. Following my argument where it leads, I arrive at this far-reaching conclusion. Private universities should have a content and viewpoint-neutral rule prohibiting all campus-based rallies and demonstrations as defined earlier. The rule should be applied regardless of the political, moral, or social cause. In other words, irrespective of whether the slogans held aloft on banners read "Abortion is murder," "Republicans are fascists," "Go solar," "We don't want no Zionists here," "Defund the police," or "Make America great again." The purpose of the rule is to preserve the academic way of life and uphold the norms for intellectual engagement with ideas that serve the distinctive and worthy mission of the modern university. The no response is far-reaching because cause-driven rallies and group demonstrations are inherently a form of expression that is one-sided, asymmetric, self-confirmed, and righteously held. And thus, from the point of view of a university that lives up to its ideals or its academic mission, they're unacceptably dogmatic, even anti-intellectual. They're anti-intellectual in the sense that their norms for expressive conduct and prescriptive messaging discourage cooperative reasoning, analysis, and discussion aimed at critically evaluating ideas. Within the space occupied by any partisan bully pulpit and its like-minded, true-believing supporters, there is little opportunity for those who disagree to challenge the amplified, fixed, and repetitive messaging. Rather than stimulating a robust democratic conversation across all sides of a controversy, a rally or demonstration masses an idea and overpowers the rights of others to debate it. It thus alienates those who disagree with its typically controversial and hence debatable message, because slogans and amplified demands at a rally or demonstration telling you what to think function more like fighting words than invitations to discuss and debate. They might even provoke a reactive and equally insular counter-rally or demonstration with its own one-sided banners and slogans. Hence, my no response is unavoidably broad and deep, because the norms for conduct definitive of a rally or demonstration transgress the norms for intellectual engagement in an academic community. All of that is unbefitting of the life of the mind. None of it is compatible with the mission of the university founded upon Humboldtian ideals. In an intellectual community, provocation becomes a virtue only when you invite those who disagree with you into a cooperative discussion or debate about your controversial ideas. Looking further into the past, one wonders what Plato, the founder of the ancient academy, would say. What do you think? How would he vote on the question of the day? Let me also respond to the related question. How do universities regulate the conduct? Should they regulate the conduct of protests on campus in light of the educational missions of these universities? Having indicated that my answer to the first question is a radical no, my answer to the second question is probably obvious. Rallies and demonstrations of the sort described earlier should be regulated by retiring them from the campus, while acknowledging and honoring their extramural importance in the public square. Unlike public universities, private universities are not obliged by the First Amendment to issue permits for intramural rallies and demonstrations, and there are good reasons to view them as transgressive forms of expression that are unbefitting in any truly academic community, whether private or public. Precisely because rallies and demonstrations are organized by dedicated political, moral, and social activists who are pre-committed to a cause and wish to draw attention to their urgent demands, they frustrate the basic academic right of students and faculty to cooperatively debate and discuss controversial ideas. As such, they lack propriety, given the Humboldtian mission of the university and its norms for evaluating ideas. When ideas are engaged and evaluated on a university campus, there's an expectation of propriety, which, as Paul Brest has reminded us, is not the same as expecting everyone to be especially polite when they engage in a robust and lively disagreement. To avoid a potential misunderstanding, let me conclude by emphasizing that I'm not suggesting that faculty and students should never participate in political rallies or mass demonstrations in support of what they view as a compelling and urgent social, political, or moral cause. There is an appropriate and readily available venue for rallies and demonstrations, namely the public square. There, under the protection of the First Amendment, citizens are free to assemble and broadcast their partisan opinions in massive, one-sided, asymmetric rallies and demonstrations, and to try and influence and persuade others by virtue of the size of the turnout they get. I was a political activist in the 1960s. As an undergraduate and even as a graduate student, I rallied, marched, and demonstrated for civil rights and against the war in Vietnam. For example, at the 1963 March on Washington, where Martin Luther King delivered his famous "I Have a Speech Dream," and at the 1967 March on the Pentagon. Many of those rallies and demonstrations were on the street, so to speak, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, in the public square, and not on the all-too-easy-to-disrupt and, in my view, precious intellectual oasis of a private university. A private university, however, is not the state, it's not the public square, and it's not a democracy. Nevertheless, and quite fortunately for us, in the United States, our incorporated private universities have become established homes for academic freedom, whereby institutional rights, ideas are discussed and debated, assumptions get challenged, rational judgment is cultivated, and a culture of critical inquiry has been fostered in which knowledge can grow and expert skills develop. One might even argue that the modern university, with its Humboldtian mission, has in effect fostered and enhanced the vibrancy of the public square, with graduates, paraphrasing Frank Fackenthal, who can take their place in the body politic, with the deep satisfaction of tested and confirmed judgment. Speaking in Humboldtian terms, I'd like to suggest that the cultivation of that kind of intellectual courage and skill suffices as the most valuable contribution the modern university can make to democratic society and democratic citizenship. I recently read an essay provocatively titled "Universities Need More Reasoning, Less Expression," written by the Northwestern legal scholar John McGinnis. He argued, as others have argued, most notably Robert Post, that quote, "A university is an institution for finding truth by reason. First Amendment doctrine aims at something different." Noted there is the difference between First Amendment-driven free speech principles, which apply in the public square, and academic freedom principles, driven, structured, and limited by the distinctive mission of our universities. In other words, Harvard Yard is not Harvard Square. The distinction is fundamental. John McGinnis suggests, as I have suggested here, that universities would be, quote, "would be better off with a simple rule against political assemblies and demonstrations, so long as it was rigorously enforced against everyone. Should such a homegrown rule be adopted by our private universities and pass constitutional review, as I think it would, I trust there will be fair and proper rule of law enforcement, perhaps informed by Professor Shirin Sinnar's essay in the course readings of this week. Honoring the spirit of this truly academic forum, I'm happy to be here as an invited guest, and thank you, Paul and Deborah, for inviting me. I've tried my best to describe what I take to be the axiomatic conception of the mission of the modern university and explain why that mission and its associated norms for engaging ideas have merit and invite a negative response to the primary question of the day. The modern university, shaped by Humboldt's ideals, is precious, distinctive, and highly vulnerable to disruption. It deserves to be protected and defended. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. And now you have a chance, Shirin, to respond, and for Richard also to respond to each other.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. So I really appreciated hearing your thoughts. I don't actually think we disagree on kind of one of your initial points, which is just that universities are about critical thinking, that we want to have spaces where people discuss and debate ideas, where we challenge each other, where we are forced to offer evidence for our points of view. I don't think we have any disagreement on that. I think we do fundamentally disagree on how and where students learn and of the role of protests as part of that. From my point of view, students learn as much, if not more, from the kinds of conversations and discussions and debates that they have outside of class, outside of the presence of faculty, in their dorm rooms, at the dining hall, on White Plaza itself. And I think, Professor Shweder, you're operating either on a caricature of student rallies and demonstrations or restricting your definition of what you find problematic to a slice of them, and to a quite narrow slice. So when you say that you're concerned about one-sided protests and demonstration, you would want to have a rule against that. I guess I'm a little bit at odds to know what that means, because protests and demonstrations by definitions have some position, right? We all have a certain position, and when you're getting together collectively, you are expressing a position. It may be for human rights, it may be against ICE, whatever that is. But essentially a position against one-sided rallies and demonstrations is a position against rallies and demonstrations at all, of all kinds. If it's an objection to the passion that's demonstrated in demonstrations, well, I think there's a room for passion and emotion, particularly when we're talking about grave human rights questions that have direct and significant and horrifying effects on people, including some of those directly on our campus. If we're concerned about chanting in unison or expressing slogans collectively, I think there's a point and a role for collective messages. And the fact that one person is saying something or that a group doesn't take away from the fact that a message is being articulated. And in terms of questioning dogma, For me, protests are often about questioning the dogma of our larger society. It's about questioning the assumptions, sometimes of the university itself, sometimes of a larger society in which a point of view has been excluded. So it's not that protests are antithetical to kind of the intellectual work. They, in fact, exemplify the questioning of dogma, the received truths of a society, and particularly of those in power. So as to the characterizations of protests or rallies and demonstrations as being akin to fighting words, or the characterization of rallies and demonstrations as being uncivil, what that brings to mind is a body of sociological research that suggests that protests are deemed uncivil when they are constituted by people of color and by people who are politically marginalized. There's a body of research that suggests those who are likely to be labeled uncivil, violent, disruptive, are more often people from particular demographic groups and those who lack political and economic power in a given context. So I am suspicious of civility discourse. I am suspicious of appeals to propriety, the kind of equation of passionate protest with fighting words, because we know that that has targeted and disproportionate effects on those who are challenging established power. So the final point I'll make is just when I think you conclude with a rule against protest and demonstration. And I appreciate the fact that you say that that would be content neutral or viewpoint neutral. But I'm a little astounded to think that students, to express a political view in community, would have to exit their own campus to find some public square. I'm not even sure if people in this room know, like, what is the public square in Palo Alto? Where would you go? This is your community. If you wanted to get a message out to Stanford or to your peers, where else might you go? Yes, of course you can go to San Francisco. Of course you can find some venue to protest. But this is the same objection that was made to protests during the Vietnam War era. Critics of those protests said, why are you protesting your universities? What are your universities doing? Why are you doing protests here? And the response of the students is, this is our community. This is where we organize. Collective action always happens in the places and communities that people are organically part of. So the notion that you would have to exit that community to engage in that kind of action elsewhere is one that just feels fundamentally at odds to me with my understanding of what a college is, particularly a residential college where you're not just coming here to take your classes. You live here, you eat here. This is your social life and your community life. And for me, it is important that this space in particular be one in which you can be your whole selves, including participating in collective action that in some context may be labeled uncivil by those in positions of power.
Well, I certainly agree that you learn a lot more outside of classroom with your peers than you do inside a classroom. I know that was my experience too. I certainly wouldn't dispute that point. I do dispute, notice I mentioned there are some disagreements that are insurmountable and others that are trivial. The trivial ones can be resolved by looking at empirical evidence. I do not think it is true that, and please notice that I characterize particular kind of rally and demonstration, and that's what I was challenging. I'm not challenging all ways of expressing disapproval with policy at a campus. There are many channels for doing that don't involve groups of like-minded people standing in the middle of the quadrangle with slogans on megaphones, repeatedly saying something and not inviting what I think is required if you're going to do that in an academic community, which is that you invite alternative points of view. Cooperatively disagreeing means putting forth, having question and answer, going back and forth. None of that happens. Of course, I agree with you. It's in the nature of these demonstrations that they're one-sided. And I don't think that putting on display your deep convictions is what universities are about, unless those convictions are put out there for the sake of having a conversation about them, especially when there are many people who disagree with them. And most of the demonstrations are about things that are certainly challengeable both ways. You're in an academic community. This is the environment for thought. The environment for action is outside. All you have to do is go to a nearby public park, on the street. There are demonstrations at universities that have taken place outside the gates and very nearby. You can do that. The public square includes an enormous amount of things. It includes websites. It includes interviews. It includes going out into things that are considered a public forum where citizens can come together and try and influence themselves in one way or another, even in very nasty ways. These things are not allowed in universities. If they were happening in a classroom, we would immediately view them as unacceptable. And because there is so much learning that goes on outside of classrooms, I think we have something like a shadow curriculum that goes on at a university, and the way it's organized is very important. And the way it should be organized is that we should always be moved. When I say this, you banish or prohibit rallies and demonstrations, I have in mind the kind I just described. Every step towards discuss and debate built into collective conversations is a step in the direction of what the university is about, and that's what I'm recommending. One of the things you read this week had a hilarious, totally misleading, but hilarious lampoon of people who think that there shouldn't be rallies and demonstrations of the type I described on college campuses. Shut up and study, Khalid and Schneider had that wonderful one-liner in their essay, which reminded me of a Ring Lardner one-liner in one of his short stories, which read, "Shut up, my father explained." Okay, that, of course, is not, it's parody. Talk about parodies. My view is just the opposite of shut up and study. My recommendation would be discuss and debate, and the more of it, the better, okay? I suppose McGinnis's would be more reasoning, less expression, that's my recommendation. I'm not suggesting when you're a student at a university, you have to spend all of your communications and life living up to the mission of the Humboldtian University. Certainly not in private spaces, certainly not in groups that get together to plan things. But when you stand out in the middle of a campus and aim at the general population of that campus and engage ideas, I think you have an obligation to do it in a particular kind of way. And the way that it's done in the kinds of rallies and demonstrations I'm talking about is anti-intellectual, precisely because it's a one-sided commitment, it's a passionate commitment, and it doesn't really allow the kind of conversations that are the norms for promoting knowledge creation and rational judgment at a university. So maybe we should let you two go jump in.
All right, well, thanks. I have a bunch of questions, so let me start with just on what you just said. I mean, protest is different than a riot, and one way of thinking about protest is it is a form of address to a community. And so I'm wondering, even though it's true, the people who are protesting are not being, maybe they're chanting slogans and they're getting carried away. They're addressing something that then gets a response from the community, and that furthers intellectual development. It might also further intellectual development, so this is really to you, Rick. It might also favor intellectual development because a point John Stuart Mill made, you can only learn some things by trying them on. And there's actually a lot of learning that goes on when people participate in demonstrations. Sometimes they figure out, I got carried away. I didn't really think that was such a good idea. Or they learn, I stood up for what I believed at some cost to myself and some courage. So one question for you is really about, is protest as anti-intellectual or anti-reasoned as you're portraying? Could it be seen as more, and again, it depends on what you have in mind, but could it be seen as entering into a dialogue with one's fellows?
So it was important to me that the question be formulated in terms of rallies and demonstrations promoting causes, not protest in general. Protest means expressing disapproval of something. You know, the First Amendment talks about petitioning the government, assembling with petitions, which are things in which you present your objections and someone meets them and tries to deal with them cooperatively, presumably. And that's what governments were required to do back then. If they got a petition from the citizens, they had to answer them. They had an obligation to answer them. You can do that at a university without producing the kind of rally and demonstration I'm talking about. There are many ways of having influence, of engaging with Board of Trustees members, of, you know, it's a very structured environment. I said it wasn't a democracy. It's not a democracy. I don't vote on who's on the Board of Trustees. Students don't vote on what the curriculum looks like. There are various areas in which you express your membership in a community within a framework that's already very structured, but does allow for expressing disapproval of all sorts of things. You learn from all sorts of things too, and I think that that's an over-inclusive consequence that what you're looking for. When I was at Harvard, you know, I was very much against the war. I wanted Harvard to denounce the war. During the time I was there, a Dow Chemical representative came on campus to look for students who might want to work for Dow Chemical. A very large number of students kidnapped him, held him hostage, basically, imprisoned him in a room where he was recruiting, and kept him there for 9 hours, okay? It was unacceptable behavior, in my view, to do that to that person. And it produced a lot of conversation later. Students talked about it, they analyzed it, they, you know, took positions on it. But do we really want to say that the fact that learning and discussion takes place really is a sanction for what produces it? I mean, you can burn down a building on the campus and you'll have learning that goes on, you'll have conversations that happen. We have to distinguish those two things. That consequence, I think, is too over-inclusive. You know, that something was learned from it. Anyway, that's my response.
Yeah, and I would just say that we're not talking about violence or kidnapping. We're not talking about anything near the level of what we actually saw in the 60s, where we did have arson of buildings and fire bombings of homes and many other things, which we have not seen in recent years, thankfully. So I just want to keep the conversation focused on the kinds of protests we are actually talking about. Now, if we were trying to devise a rule against anti-intellectual protests, how would we actually do that? What would we actually mean by that? I mean, just trying to imagine, like, what would that rule look like? Effectively, I think it would mean that we would outlaw all rallies and demonstrations, because there's no other way to characterize what you object to in an objective enough fashion that we could settle on some specific type of protest that we think is too dogmatic to be on a university campus. So we would end up with a vastly over-inclusive rule. And maybe you're comfortable with that, because when you do say that people should just go out to the public square, you know, find wherever that is, it does seem like a certain level of comfort with just excluding all of that activity from campus. But if you agree that there is some value in protest, that there is some learning in protest, just not in this very specifically defined category of what you think is anti-intellectual, then how would you allow for the benefits of that you know, while devising a rule that would apply, you know, much more broadly? So I guess I'm having a hard time seeing that. And just the last point in terms of, you know, you mentioned engagement with the Board of Trustees or other kinds of action. Students who are protesting typically are protesting in part to have the opportunity to engage in that way. And part of why they protest is because they are denied opportunities to engage, or past appeals to the Board of Trustees or those in power have been met by neglect or ignorance, or sometimes not even a response. So, you know, it reminds me of a point that Dr. Martin Luther King made in Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he was responding to white moderates who basically said, well, we agree with your goals and your vision, but we disagree with direct action. And, you know, essentially, what he said is, we would love to be able to negotiate. In fact, the nonviolent direct action that we engage in is a method to get us to the place where we can negotiate because it has created enough creative tension so that somebody will be forced to listen and to have the conversation that we are right now excluded from having. So I don't see these two things as, attempts to go through student government or negotiate or other forms of collective protest and action as being completely apart from the rallies and demonstrations that seek, in some cases, to create the creative pressure in order to provide those opportunities.
Well, thank you for those comments. I just want to make two quick observations. I've actually tried out what I just delivered here on 4 friends, all well-known legal scholars, and I've noticed a very similar pattern of responses, and they identify what I think you have to think about as potential objections to what I've argued. One, you just heard from Shirin, which is the definitional issue, and how are you going to define that which really counts versus a pep rally at a football game, for example. I think that is quite possible, and I think what we should be doing, actually everything that comes closer to this course, what's happening right here, would be a measure on one side of some spectrum, and you look at all of the kinds of assemblies of various kinds that take place at universities, and I think you can begin to characterize them. They differ in all sorts of ways. The people who, for example, who go to a musical performance or to the theater, which is an assembly, want to be there. They sometimes have to get tickets to go there. They're expressing a preference, okay? The kinds of things that take place in rallies and demonstrations that I'm talking about are imposed essentially on the community. It's not people wanting to be there. Often they don't want to hear what they're hearing. And it seems to me that we can go ahead and try and classify, I tend to view the demonstrations I have in mind as sort of sort of shadow curricula. I know it's very popular to say, well, there's the curriculum and these things hold there, and then outside that it's all extracurricular and the rules are very different. They are very different for some things. I don't think they are for the kinds of rallies I have in mind because they are shadow curricula. And when you, at a university, are going to start engaging ideas and putting them on other people in the community for assessment, there have to be the conditions for actually having an assessment, not having one-sided communication going on. So that's one of the reasons I'm opposed to it. The other argument is, well, why don't you just go ahead and look at the benefits, not just the costs of doing this, just a straight-out analysis of that type. That's where we get back into, do we agree on the facts? And I think we should start doing that. My experience is an incredible drop in trust on college campuses in this last round of demonstrations that took place, in which people felt alienated from their classmates and felt that they were not in an academic environment, but that the university was being totally politicized, and it wasn't why they went to college, okay? So I think that's a second thing. Finally, just on democratic citizenship, because that came up. When I look into what does that mean, I see 4 different notions of what democratic citizenship amounts to and how you implement it. One is we should have civics courses that are required at the university so that students graduate knowing what the Constitution is, or could name more than a few of the amendments on the Bill of Rights, or know how the judiciary is organized, and so forth and so on. A second view is that you should train students so that they become competent in political participation in the public square, okay? Another notion is we want our students to be advocates for essentially the American way of life, for the political values and social values of the United States. And the fourth is something like we should imbue them to be motivated and to desire a kind of civic Republican ideal of citizenship, which is service to the nation, okay? Each one of those things has to be analyzed carefully. I don't think any of them necessarily lead to, therefore, that we should have rallies and demonstrations on the college campus. I also think 2 of them look like indoctrination to me, and that we become an agency of propaganda when all of a sudden we imagine that going into political philosophy might not lead you to criticize aspects of the American political arrangement, or to actually think there are times when alternative arrangements might be desirable.
So I want to ask you both about location, because location comes up as a point of disagreement, since on the one hand, you favor participation in the public square, or at least don't oppose it. You think it's important. You think it shouldn't be limited to outside the walls of the campus. But actually at Stanford, we do something a little odd, which is we create a space on campus that we say is like the public square, right? But it's a very bounded space. So White Plaza forms this space where you can protest or have a rally. I mean, there's still, there's time, place, and manner restrictions, but it is the public square on campus. You can't do it outside a classroom. So I just wonder, for both of you, how much does it matter that it's in the walls, or could it, or outside the walls? And if you're more amenable to inside the walls, would you be amenable to very, very tight restrictions on what inside the walls mean?
Yeah, well, I think I've already stated my position on there should be wide latitude within the campus boundaries for protests. So then the narrower question is, well, where on campus? Is it okay to have designated free speech zones, and do we have a different set of rules in other public areas on campus or near classrooms, for instance? So I have a couple of thoughts on this. First, I do think it's valuable that we have officially designated certain spaces as essentially free speech zones. It does show a level of affirmative commitment to bringing aspects of a public square onto campus. My concern is that those zones are themselves limiting and limited, and that even at Stanford, where I think we, relative to other higher ed institutions, our rules may not be as restrictive as some, so I will acknowledge that. But on this question of where protests can happen, if, for instance, you're protesting a speaker that you find controversial, right? We have told our students that we don't want speakers to be disrupted, that invited speakers should be entitled to get their message across to those who want to hear it. But we now don't allow there to be free speech zones outside the academic building where they might be speaking, right? So now, if you have a targeted you want to protest a particular person who's come into campus, whose, let's say, ideas you disagree with. In the past, we used to tell students, don't interrupt the event, don't disrupt the event. You can leaflet outside, or you can ask hard questions inside, or you can have a protest outside. Now, our default rule is you can't actually have the protest outside because that's not a free speech zone. You might have to go many blocks away where your message is no longer effective because your very audience was that person inside the building or those who have come to hear that person. So I do think our rules have become so restrictive that we're actually curtailing the space for effective protest.
Yeah. I don't love the idea of confining students off on some periphery. I think that if you're going to have a protest, that feels like it's not fair. But I think they should be outside the gate and not inside the gate. And, I visited Brigham Young University a few years ago. I have students who are on the faculty there. I was giving a talk there. I arrived, and right outside the gate of Brigham Young was a protest of evangelical Christians denouncing them as heretics, okay? And it's pretty startling to see this going on, but it was clear to me that you don't want that inside the gate, okay? That if this was a public forum, it would be a disaster. And the same thing with regard to universities. Universities are not public fora. If they were public fora and the First Amendment rules applied, you could have paparazzi coming in here harassing every faculty member with microphones and cameras and so forth, because that's what paparazzi do. They take advantage of the First Amendment in the public square. That's allowed. We don't allow that on college campuses. That's why academic freedom is different from free speech. The fact that you're calling them free speech zones suggests you're modeling them on the public square and acting as though that area is now a public forum. I think you should call them academic freedom zones, and I think what goes on in those zones should be discuss and debate. You come on any issue you have, any conviction you have, anything you think is terrible about the way the university or the world is running, bring it up there. Put up your proposition like you're doing here, and then let's do what we're doing in this class and on this stage right now. That's what an academic life is. The political life is different. And if you let the political world, the public square, come into the campus, everything changes. Think about Charter House rules and seminars, okay? You can go into a public park with your iPhone and record what people say and do there and put it up on social media, and you're protected by the First Amendment in doing that. You can't do that in a seminar. You can't come in and then say, go to social media, or secretly record what goes on in the seminar, put it on social media, see what so-and-so said today. And for good educational reasons, we don't allow that. There's a huge difference between the political world. The First Amendment protects it. It builds up the public square. Things go on there that you don't want happening on a university if you really believe in the mission that it's about.
And if I could just respond to just the last part of that, I think there are different contexts even within a university, right? So some distinguish this as the professional zone where, of classrooms and curricular instruction and so on, where it's closer, the standards you would want are more reflective of the academic environment, of the fact that the disciplines have their own way of assessing knowledge claims, and so forth. The rules in a classroom are going to be different than the rules in the public square. So I think that differentiation and the idea that different speech rules would apply within a classroom context, I don't object to that. But for me, this idea that therefore all political rallies or demonstrations should be excluded from the campus altogether, despite the fact that that's where people live and work and consider their community, that's the part that, that I fundamentally disagree with.
So I have a question for each of you. And after that, we'll do the polling question again, and then I hope that my guess is a number of you have questions out there. So I'm going to use, Shirin, your example of characterizing Israel's behavior in Gaza as genocide. That's something where if the university had taken a position on that, then that would be a huge megaphone in which megaphones in response would seem appropriate. But the university hasn't taken a position on that. So my question for you is, to what extent does a rally which asserts that Israel has committed genocide, when this is an issue contested, not just by Israel, but by scholars, to what extent do protests help explore that issue? And for you, Rick, using the same issue, to what extent does a protest or a series of protests, all of which assert that Israel has committed genocide, inhibit classroom discussion or dorm discussions of that issue?
So I think protests help explore the issue by introducing the issue. In many contexts, that question of whether Israel was committing not just genocide, but apartheid or any other war crime, crimes against humanity, all of these questions was not even being discussed within university settings. I'll just give you one example. Students aimed to have a discussion on medical apartheid in Israel at the School of Medicine. And they were essentially suppressed from having that conversation because they were told that that topic and framing itself would be offensive. So part of what protests do is to introduce questions that are being, in some cases, either deliberately excluded from academic settings or are just not in the discourse. Now, there can be further conversation about that. There can be conversations about legal definitions of genocide under international law and whether any country's actions amount to that definition. That's a conversation that is now actually happening in many places, but one that in many respects was brought to public consciousness by protesters before it was brought in any kind of official form.
So I just want to reiterate, my position is discuss and debate. And having a robust conversation seems to me to allow someone to come forward and say Israel's committing genocide. That's what I believe, and then to essentially have the conversation. It doesn't happen as a conversation when it's people chanting that in a public square, in the middle of the quadrangle. Quite the contrary, it just irritates those who disagree with them, and it does suppress conversation. And that's part of the empirical issue here. Let's go and see whether the purported benefits are actually happening. In my limited experience, I don't think that's what's happening at all. I think it produces polarization on the campus. You no longer feel like you're members of the same community. Sometimes you feel like you're an enemy combatant on the campus. And so there are all sorts of ways in which it backfires. But yes, you want to argue that all Republicans are fascists? Do so. That's what we do at the universities. We talk about controversial, upsetting things. The fact that it upsets someone does not a grounds for suppression. It shouldn't be. To the extent those conversations are being suppressed, that's what should be corrected. But it's not the alternative, as described by Paul, seems to me to not be something which has produced positive, beneficial aspects with regard to that issue. In fact, it's almost impossible for someone to say, no, that's right, that's a ridiculous, I think that's a ridiculous definition, and it's being used totally for political purposes. You can't say that. It doesn't happen. People bite their tongue. The amount of tongue biting that goes on at universities is not going down as a result of these demonstrations. It's going up, at least in my experience. Final point, with regard to protests about speakers. At least in my view of the university, and in my view about how inviting speakers should work, it's a very decentralized process. Any unit, certainly my university, any unit, any department, any committee, any dormitory, if they have an internal discussion and decide we would benefit from having this speaker, they are free to invite him. It's not vetted. No dean reviews it. No provost says yes or no. And it seems to me that if you agree that that's a good system, as I do think it is, then it seems to me you have an obligation to treat anyone who comes as a guest on your campus. You're the host. And to object and protest some other group who's decided this is the person we like to hear is just another example of allowing politics to creep into the private university, and it's, to me, a bad thing.
Rick, let me just ask one quick follow-up, because Shirin says, with respect to my example, that raising the issue of genocide then creates an issue which can be discussed in classrooms and in dorms. Do you agree?
No, I think the way it's happened, I'm sorry. I think, well, we'd have to look and see what happened. Has it been discussed? Has there been systematic conversation as a result of them? I'd like to know. I do think that in any seminar I give, I could put that proposition out there and have a conversation about it, and we'd get further than we get by listening to people on megaphones shouting it with all the implications that go with it. It just creates hostility.
Can I just say a couple of things? One is we keep falling back on a characterization of what is happening on college campuses that I think is grossly mischaracterizing some of the protests that we've seen. And so to this idea that rallies and demonstrations have not raised the issue, again, I just want to give you the example of the sit-in to stop the genocide at White Plaza, which was surfacing that very question for months. Now, people can have different views over the sit-in, different views over debate. There were multiple debates. There were, there was another tent, the blue and white Israel tent, pro-Israel tent that was set up. But my point here is just that together, the discourse there on White Plaza was, again, some of the richest discourse on campus that I saw. And that was deliberately structured by those who put on the sit-in. So I want to just read to you something that struck me quite a bit, which is a sign on conversation norms that the sit-in had put right in front of their set of tents. They said, "We are nonviolent in our words and actions. We are respectful in our tone and language. If you are yelling or raising your voice, we won't continue conversing. We don't take photos or videos that include faces of people in the sit-in. We respect freedom of speech. We don't take down signs, and we ask that you don't take down ours." And from that starting point, there literally were hundreds of conversations across difference that occurred in that space. So again, to return to this characterization of what we saw on campuses as not raising discussion or not allowing for conversation, I think is just a mischaracterization.
So I think we're going to put up the poll again. By the way, on the issue of inviting speakers, I probably don't fully agree with you, because I actually think that we treat the inviting of speakers as more of a First Amendment issue than an academic, issue, because lots of groups on campus, including not departments and not just faculty, can invite speakers, and sometimes they invite speakers who are with just the motivation to provoke and not to further discussion. And there it does seem to me that if somebody's inviting somebody to provoke, you can go in and ask questions and raise hard questions, but you could also have a protest, outside that says, if you're going to treat it as a First Amendment issue. Otherwise, there should be tighter rules on who comes to campus. Although there's dangers in that, of course.
I think there's very little change in the polling, if I could. And meanwhile, while you contemplate that, would you please put up the attendance question? And also, since I have the mic, why don't anybody who has questions, please come to the mics. There are mics on both sides of the room.
Hello, I'm an undergraduate here at Stanford. I was just surprised there wasn't discourse surrounding the felony vandalism charges 2 years ago by the kind of Gazan protest group, and I just want if you guys to discuss it and talk about it.
For those who don't know, students who occupied the president's office and created a lot of damage were recently tried, and it ended in a hung jury, but this question is asking about, do you have thoughts about this? It was a protest. Actually, it relates, I think, Shirin, to something you write about in your article, which is about punishment for breaking rules and whether or not, in fact, you should punish students for breaking rules in certain contexts.
Right. Well, I'll say a couple of things about that particular protest. First, that I think the levying of felony charges by the district attorney is virtually unprecedented at this point in terms of responses to the pro-Palestine protests, including other building occupations around the country. And so the sanctions here, or attempted sanctions, are particularly severe and unprecedented. And these are students who have already faced disciplinary sanctions, suspensions for multiple quarters, loss of housing and other services during that time. So to insist in particular on that severity of charge seems to me to be completely unjustified. People can have different views about that form of protest, about its communicative efficacy, about its legitimacy. These are all kind of debates that one might have, but responding in that fashion, I think, was inappropriate. I think also we need to come back to the question of what is it that people are protesting. And so, I think about just returning to the issue for which the students protested and why they took those steps. So if you are protesting what you believe is a genocide, and you believe you have tried every means to get the attention of the university, if you see the university as complicit in its funding and other decisions, then you are acting out of conscience. So whether or not we ultimately agree with that form, that manifestation, that, the particulars of their civil disobedience, I do think that we need to judge and have the conversation over consequences or what should come of it in light of the conscientious reason for which the students took the actions that they did.
I just simply have to say that explanations of that sort are not justifications. I do believe that there are points where conscience has to be honored, and I think that the kinds of conscience that gets honored more broadly are when people see some merit in it. That's very important, and someone's willing to take risks for their own conscience. I'm certainly moved by such things. I think there's a basis for them. I just want to emphasize that I think faculty at any university want their students to succeed. I mean, punishing students is not something one wants to do, and certainly not punitively like that. The approach I would take is more educational. It seems to me that if you come to a university, you should know what its mission is. The university has a responsibility to make it clear, to talk about what the norms are and how they're rational in the relationship to the mission, that these are things that we honor here, and if you want to be here, these are the things that you're going to be held to. And I can imagine a week in orientation where there's a lot of education about what a university and an academic environment is and what it isn't, and even an honor code that people have to commit to if they want to be at this place. And then if it's broken, it seems to me, there's going to be a warning. Here's the code, you broke it. This is what we're about. If it's broken again, it does seem to me there has to be some enforcement. So maybe it's suspension for a quarter. And if it come back and then you do it again, you're banished. You're not part of this community. This community has a tradition, it has a mission, and if you want to be part of it, that's the mission it's for. It's like going into a monastery or a retreat where the rules are we're going to be silent for a month. That's the whole point of being in this retreat. And then you come in and you hold a protest. You have conscience, objection to people being silent. I mean, the institution has every reason to stop you from doing it and kick you out if you can't understand what it's about and how it's going to function.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you all very much for the lively discussion today. It's been wonderful. I have a question particularly for Professor Shweder. I was interested in hearing a little bit more about your first principle arguments from a Humboldtian point of view, and specifically applied to limiting or banning protests, because the hurdle that I'm trying to get over here is, from my understanding of a Humboldtian point of view, it's anti-tongue biting, and protests encourage like tongue biting, and for faculty and students to be silent on views they have. But I'm curious what the implication of banning protests are, because from the point of view how I see it, I feel like banning protests in itself might be an act of tongue biting the other side. So how would you sort through that?
I do think that the Humboldtian conception probably looks back at Plato's Academy. And Plato's Academy was created as a haven from politics. The agora was over there and all these nasty things were happening. When you came to the academy, you were going to engage in thought, you were going to engage in argument, you were going to engage in reasoning. And there were no protests at Plato's Academy. That would be unthinkable. The point was not to have protests, not to be political, but to have it be an area for reflection and discussion and debate. I also want to again distinguish between protest in the sense of having ways of making your objections to things known and the kind of rallies and demonstrations I'm talking about. And I was happy to hear that an environment was set up in which people actually agreed they weren't going to do this, they weren't going to do that, and it produced conversation. My point in the idea of banning it is to ban something that has the characteristics I described, maybe hold out this course as somewhere else on the opposite side of the spectrum, and encouraging every step we can take to move things in that direction, towards environments of cooperative conversation between people who disagree. And when it becomes one-sided, amplified, repetitive, and fixed, it no longer is there. So we have to think about ways of bringing it there so that we have that kind of conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both for your fantastic arguments. To Professor Shweder, independent of previous legal precedent like Healy versus James, do you think protests, rallies, demonstrations should be allowed at public universities?
At public universities?
Yeah, public universities.
That's a great question. I tried to hint at it in my talk when I asked, is the mission any different at a public university and a private university? No, I think there should be consistency with respect to mission. And unfortunately, in my view, public universities are treated as though they're state actors. And there have been a couple of decisions in the Supreme Court which, it's a mess, the Supreme Court decisions, actually. Robert Post writes all about the ways in which any attempt to have a constitutional First Amendment theory of academic freedom is totally in shambles. And when you look at even some of the most well-known cases, Tinker, for example, versus Des Moines, Iowa school system there, where students wore black armbands in the high school and even younger, protesting the war in Vietnam. And they were breaking a rule which had been set up with anticipating what they were going to do to discourage protests in the school. And the Supreme Court made a decision supporting the students doing it. But if you read the decision, they actually say, we have to take into account the mission of the university or the school. And although there's a slogan that came out of that decision, which is something like, you don't shed your First Amendment rights when you go through the schoolhouse gate or something like that, which is talked about all the time, it's very misleading because when you actually look at the decision, they are explicit that they're including very narrow notion of the free speech domain. In this case, it was a silent protest. There was no disruption. And they explicitly say, this is not about, and they give a list of things it's not about, and it's not about demonstrations. Okay. So the court has not said you can go on to, you can have a demonstration in a public space, but you have a constitutional right to do that. They did not say that, and it's important to understand that distinction. I think that, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech is about Congress, and it's about Congress, which is different from publicly funding a mission. Okay, the people who manage a public school are not in the role of Congress people making laws which censor things and have criminal results, treat them as criminal violations. So it seems to me that there are some distinctions yet to be acknowledged fully by the courts, which might one day treat public universities the same way I'm advocating for private universities, although it's going to be an uphill battle to do that.
Thank you.
I would just say there is a lot of confusion in some of the doctrine, but just one actual small point that I want to make, because also one of the articles that you may have read for today was Robert Post's piece on the managerial authority and sphere of public schools. And I just want to make the small point that when we are talking about K through 12 schools, not all of that translates to a university setting. And so what we might think of as the proper kind of role of tutelage or the managerial sphere of a public school that has kindergartners or even high schoolers is somewhat different from what we expect from public or from universities, which are where the people within them are adults. And also that universities are often residential settings, so the kinds of restrictions you might think are appropriate or justifiable in a 5 or 6 hour school day are quite different if applied to a university setting in which you live and work and all of your activity takes place in that setting. So just a small point that it's also important to keep those contexts a bit different.
My question is for Professor Shweder. I was wondering whether your prescription of a more blanket ban on demonstrations and rallies differ with different types of universities, or private universities with different missions, right? Obviously, there's universities that emphasize inquiry and academic pursuit for its own sake. But it seems to me over the past 4 years at Stanford has a particular focus on practice and citizenship. And part of Stanford's educational mission, from my experience, has been to educate citizens to engage, whether in the academic life or in the civic life or in their personal lives. And part of that engagement entails constructive engagement in sit-down settings, but also protest and activism and civic engagement outside of quote-unquote civil settings. And in cases where a student feels like the university has an unjust policy or an unjust protocol, and they choose to try to enact change as part of their civic duty as a member of the Stanford community, why should we curtail them of like one tool in their toolkit? Sure, they can negotiate and use dialogue, but isn't like stopping them from using demonstration and rallies as a tool in their civic toolkit kind of anti-civics? Isn't that kind of not modeling like the full expansiveness of the civic engagement they could use?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Universities say a lot of things, and they have a lot of auxiliary missions. I mean, the university has become a multiverse with lots and lots of auxiliary missions. I don't think any university that's a university is going to say, no, we're not interested in knowledge production and increasing rational judgment. That's sort of the core mission. The question then becomes, do other missions, add to, do they not interfere with that mission? And you certainly can, there are many universities, some universities that are parochial universities, and they have blasphemy laws. Brigham Young University has a blasphemy law. There are certain things you can't say or denounce at Brigham Young University. And that's a different kind of mission from the kind of secular schools we have that are built on the Humboldtian model. I would guess, again, I would hazard a guess, and the guess is that the curriculum at Stanford University or other universities that now exists would have to be other than it is if they were truly having the kind of mission you described. I mean, you would have a course, Rallies and Demonstrations 101, in which you'd be trained in how to do demonstrations in the public square. Maybe you'd set aside the football field as a practice ground. You presumably would do it neutral to content, because you wouldn't want to have a course which was advocating any particular thing. But, you'd be a student in that, and this week you would have a demonstration on Make America Great, again, and next week it would be on Go Solar. And, if you're in the course, you'd try to figure out ways to effectively do that, and you'd practice it under the supervision of faculty who knew how to practically do things of that type. My own experience is I didn't need the university I was at to teach me how to go down to Washington. In 1963, I was 18 years old. It was not something that was such a specialized skill that I couldn't figure out how to go to a demonstration and protest. Okay, and I'm happy I was there. I remember Martin Luther King's speech. I was 18 years old. Okay, I hadn't been in university very long when I did that. I didn't need it. Okay, I don't think there's a lot of universities putting up statements about what they're doing, often because they're worried about funding or the impression they have with the public. So we're advocating democratic citizens here. I doubt there's a test to see whether you know the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So, I guess that's about all I can say at this point. Thank you for the question.
Good afternoon. Thank you guys both for the wonderful discussion that we had today. I found it very insightful and refreshing. My question is geared towards the systemic level of suppression by the federal government and by university administration, and how that weaponization of federal funding and the revocation of student visas has affected students here on campus, not just with the participation in protests and rallies, but actual debate and conversations that you mentioned here on campus because of that installed fear. We've seen examples of this, like the international Turkish students in Tufts University that wrote an op-ed mentioning the situation in Palestine and Israel, and then we've also seen the Mahmoud Khalil and his visa getting revoked for participating in the Palestinian protests in Israel. And we've seen this affect students nationwide and their participation not just in the Palestine and Israel issue, but in all political issues.
I think it's had, I can take that. I think it's had a devastating effect. And, I agree that it's absolutely at multiple levels. It's at the level of individual visa revocations. I think the case of Rumeysa Öztürk is a really significant one because, if it is the case that the government can just abduct somebody from their neighborhood because they wrote an op-ed piece simply advocating divestment from Israel, then no one is safe. No form of political speech for an international student is safe, right? And I've had so many conversations with students who are international students, some of whom are naturalized U.S. citizens, but born abroad, who've told me the kinds of speech that they no longer feel comfortable making. And it's not just at protests, it's in their papers for class, it's in what they try to get published, it's certainly what they might say or write for the Stanford Daily, right? The Stanford Daily launched a free speech, is litigating a case against the government's actions because of the effect on their entire newspaper staff, and particularly the international students there. At the same time, the systemic level, so not just individual visa revocations, but the loss of federal funding has prompted many institutions to impose some of these draconian speech restrictions in a way that's really corrosive. So it's partly because we're in that kind of climate where we see growing authoritarianism and attacks on universities, in addition to other institutions of potential dissent in society, that I'm particularly concerned that when we disempower students from protest, and when we say that your protest should be restricted in all of these limited ways, we're disabling forms of civic and community engagement and resistance that are especially needed in a moment of growing authoritarianism.
Yeah, we overlap in reactions. I think that I want to make it clear that I'm on the one hand trying to preserve the haven, the oasis, the temple of reason of the private university campus for academic freedom. But I also think that the public square has to be something we're very concerned about. Writing an op-ed is in the public square. And the United States has a relatively rich public square, but it's eroding. And I'm strongly in favor of making sure we have that zone, that public forum in which citizens can express opinions, try to influence each other, for the sake of, the whole point that Robert Post is making is that the First Amendment is about democratic participation with regard to government and who governs you. If you want a society of, where government is of the people, by the people, and for the people have to be the ones who are deciding who's in government. The government can't be the one who's deciding what they should be saying about who should be in government or what the government's doing. So I share everything that was said about the erosion of the public square. I just don't think we want the public square inside the haven, which is meant to be separated from politics and to allow for thought and discussion and debate, rather than one-sided mass influence, which is a political process.
Thank you.
Thank you both for your time. One thing that I've noticed when it comes to private universities, and if not elite universities, we always tend to describe it as insert school color bubble, being that when you are in these universities, you are in a much more protected space than you would be in other areas, whether it be you're working, you might be in underprivileged institutions that have less resources available, or you're in countries that doesn't have the same kind of speech protections as the United States. And I was curious, when it comes to protests, at least in universities, it's a rare opportunity where you actually know the people who are having this, maybe a one-sided effort, but you have a much easier way of communicating with them and speaking with them than you would a protester on the street, for instance. And for us, when we want to go out there after we leave this community through graduation and potentially combat forces that will be very one-sided, should universities focus on that element of education, of preparing students for the world outside of academia, or should it be more about the ideas generated in academia? I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
You know, anyone can have a conversation with someone handing you a leaflet. It's one-on-one. You can look at that leaflet. You can ask why they're doing it. That's very different. This is sort of within what I was saying earlier about trying to classify different types of things that happen on campus, which are communicative events or dealing with ideas. You can have those conversations without being in the form of a rally or a demonstration, the type that I just talked about. And on the other hand, if you really want to be prepared for what goes on in the public square, I was suggesting earlier that I don't really think a lot of preparation was necessary to go off in the public square and demonstrate. I don't see universities really doing that at the moment. And would you want that? Would you want a course on how to demonstrate? I mean,
Is it rhetorical or?
well,
I think we do have courses, not on how to demonstrate, but we have courses on organizing. We have courses on social movement theory. We have courses on law and social movements, and we should have more of that.
well,
Like,
that's
I actually
fine.
think that there's a lot
Put
of
it all in the
learning.
curriculum. That's fine. Put it on the street
but
and in the curriculum.
It can't just be that, right? It can't just be that. It's you learn most by doing. We're always talking about experiential learning. So why would we take away from students during these 4 years, or more for graduate students? But why would we take away the opportunity to learn by doing during the very years that they're here and as part of this community?
My point is because you don't want them to learn to behave with regard to ideas in ways that are contrary to the way in which we deal with ideas in an academic environment. The environment is about thought. This is not the place for activism. You can plan your activism. You can be an activist while you're a student. Nothing stops you from doing that. Many people are students who go off on demonstrations that are issues that are important to them. But when you start doing it on the campus, you are now creating a very different environment. You're creating the public square in the campus, and that's a very different place.
Before
So as you can
Deborah
see,
brings
we
us to
can
a
go
close,
on.
I just have, this last round made me think maybe we should have a course on football instead of a football team.
So please join me in thanking our speakers for a very lively and interesting discussion of the issues.